the end of Shrek 2, Princess Fiona makes what I think is one of the most powerful decisions in the entire franchise. She chooses to stay an ogre with Shrek instead of living out the rest of her life as a human princess. On the surface, it feels like the most obvious choice for the story, but when you sit with it for a moment, it's actually way deeper than that. Fiona has spent most of her life dreaming of the fairy tale ending, being rescued, marrying her prince, and living happily ever after. So why, when given a chance to finally have that so-called perfect life, did she turn it down? In this video, I'm going to explore the layers behind that choice. We're going to look at Princess Fiona's childhood and how being locked away in a tower shaped her view of herself, her strained relationship with her parents, and the world's expectations of her. And most importantly, how her love for Shrek completely redefined what happily ever after really meant to her. Because Fiona's decision wasn't just about staying an ogre. It was about choosing her authentic self, love, and a life that felt true to who she really was. In the first Shrek movie, when we meet Princess Fiona, she's trapped in a tower waiting for her Prince Charming. And not just any prince, the one that she's been told her whole life will come for her. But as we know, that prince didn't ride in on a noble steed. Instead, her rescuer was an ogre with a donkey by his side. And the way that Fiona reacts when she realizes Shrek is an ogre says so much. She's shocked, confused, and honestly, she's disappointed. Because for Fiona, it was engraved in her mind since childhood that her rescuer was supposed to be a tall, handsome human. When we move into Shrek 2, the film actually shows us exactly where that expectation came from. When Fiona and Shrek arrive in Far, Far Away to meet her parents for the first time since she was rescued, we get this really important moment where we see Fiona's childhood bedroom. It's like stepping into a time capsule of everything she was ever taught to believe about herself and her future. Her room is filled with dolls, decorations, posters, and little details that all paint the same picture. Fiona's entire identity was built around being the perfect princess who would marry the perfect Prince Charming. Even her diary entries that we briefly see reflect the same dream. And these details were very intentional. The writers put these details here to show us that Fiona's childhood wasn't just a normal royal upbringing. It was almost like she was conditioned to believe that there was only one way for her life to work out. She was born into royalty, raised on a fairy tale expectation, and then literally locked into a tower until her prince came. So when Shrek shows up instead of the fairy tale prince that she imagined, that shock wasn't just about him being an ogre. It was about her whole world view being flipped upside down. What's even more heartbreaking is how that connects to her relationship with her parents. King Harold and Queen Lillian clearly wanted their daughter to marry Prince Charming. And this makes sense once we learn that Harold made a deal with the fairy godmother. So Fiona wasn't just raised to expect a perfect prince. Her parents had always essentially promised her life away before she even had a say. That makes Fiona's childhood less about who she wanted to be and more about what was expected from her. So when Fiona chooses at the end of Shrek 2 to stay an ogre with Shrek, it's not just about a cute romantic ending. It's a complete rejection of everything she was told she was supposed to want ever since she was a little girl. It's her looking at the pink princess-filled childhood room, those years in a tower, and even her parents' expectations and saying, "That's not me. This is who I really am." When we first meet Fiona's parents in Shrek 2, their reaction says everything. The second they see Fiona still in her ogre form, they're shocked. Not the "oh my gosh, it's been so long since we've seen our daughter" shock, but the "what happened to her" kind of shock. The disgust and discomfort on their face makes it painfully clear of how they view her ogre side, and by extension, how Fiona learned to view it herself. If we think back to the first Shrek movie, Fiona was deeply ashamed of her ogre form. She hid it from Shrek and Donkey for as long as she possibly could, waiting until nighttime to transform in secret. She was terrified that if Shrek knew the truth, he would see her as ugly and unworthy of love. And that shame didn't just come out of nowhere. It was planted by the people who were supposed to love her most, her parents. From Fiona's perspective, her ogre side wasn't just an unfortunate condition. It was the very reason that she was locked away. She was literally banished to a tower by her own parents, raised with the promise that one day a handsome prince will save her and finally fix her. That narrative made Fiona believe that her ogre identity was something to be erased. It was a curse that made her undeserving of love, affection, and even freedom. And that's the heartbreaking part. Fiona's parents framed her entire existence around becoming human again. They told her that once the curse was broken, she would finally be complete, finally worthy, and finally have the life that she was meant to live. So of course, she longed for that day. She clung to it. She believed her human form was valuable, beautiful, and worthy of admiration, while her ogre form was the opposite. It was ugly, shameful, and something to be hidden. You can really see the weight of that in the way that Fiona carries herself. Her human side became almost performative, something that she put on like a role she was expected to play. And her ogre side, that was buried in the shadows, something to cover up. something that she prayed no one will ever see. Every single day she spent in that tower reinforced the same message. Your ogre form is a curse, a flaw, the reason you're locked away. And Fiona internalized it. She planned her whole future around breaking the curse, around hiding her true self until someone came into her life to fix her. That's why in the first Shrek, she was initially so desperate and eager to marry Lord Farquaad. Not because she loved him, but because she thought that he represented freedom, acceptance, and finally becoming the version of herself that her parents told her she was supposed to be. Which makes it even more powerful that by the end of Shrek 2, Fiona doesn't just reject Prince Charming and the fairy godmother's vision for her life, but she also rejects the story that her parents wrote for her. She realizes that her worth was never tied to being human, and that the ogre side of herself, the side that she was taught to be ashamed of, is actually her truest, most authentic version of who she is. Now, if Fiona's parents shaped the way she saw herself, King Harold in particular is the clearest example of where that mindset came from. At the end of Shrek 2, we learned that Harold was actually born a frog, and only became a human because of the deal that he made with the fairy godmother. This is revealed during the climatic fight when Harold jumps in front of Shrek and Fiona to protect them, and the fairy godmother's magic bounces off of his chest, turning him back into his true form. For Fiona, this moment is shocking, not just because her father is suddenly a frog, but because it puts everything into perspective of why he treated her ogre side the way that he did. Earlier in the movie, the fairy godmother makes it clear that Harold's human life was something given to him, and she could easily take it away. She says, "I gave you your happily ever after, Harold, and I can take it away." That line alone tells us everything. Harold was in debt to the fairy godmother. His entire marriage, his crown, and his reputation all came at the cost of denying who he really was. And part of that deal meant that Fiona would marry the fairy godmother's son, Prince Charming. That explains why Harold was so resistant to Shrek from the beginning. But the real tragedy is how Harold's shame of being a frog ended up being projected onto Fiona. Just like Harold hid his true self in order to be loved and accepted, he taught Fiona the same thing, through his words, his decisions, and his silence. That ogre side needed to be hidden too. Locking Fiona in a tower wasn't just about protecting her from a curse. It was Harold repeating his own story with her. He buried his frog identity under the mask of a human king. And in turn, he forced Fiona to bury her ogre identity under the fantasy of a human princess. That's why Harold tells Fiona in a heartbreaking moment that he never wanted her to see him in this way. For him, being a frog meant weakness, rejection, and the fear of not being good enough. But the irony is, in trying so hard to shield Fiona from seeing him this way, he unintentionally passed down the same shame and fear that haunted him. But Shrek 2 gives Harold a chance to grow. Instead of being casted out, he's embraced. Queen Lillian doesn't flinch at him being a frog. In fact, she tells him that he's more of a man for standing up for Fiona and Shrek's marriage. Even the kingdom accepts him. That moment of love and reassurance is so important because Fiona witnesses it too. She sees what years of rejecting your true self did to her father, how it filled him with fear and regret. But she also sees what happens when you finally let go of that shame and allow yourself to be loved for who you really are. So when Fiona makes that choice at the end of the movie to remain an ogre with Shrek, it's not just about a love story. It's about breaking a generational cycle of shame. She refuses to repeat Harold's mistake of hiding who she really is in order to fit society's definition of a happily ever after. Fiona realizes that yes, life might be easier if she and Shrek stayed human. They'd be more accepted by society, celebrated, and admired. But it wouldn't be real. It would be a choice made out of fear. The fear of rejection and not being good enough. And Fiona had already lived that fear her whole life. So instead, she chooses to be authentic. She chooses love. She chooses Shrek and she chooses herself. And by doing so, Fiona embraces the part of herself that she was taught to bury. And in that choice, she finds the freedom that her father never gave himself until it was almost too late. Up until now, we've talked about Fiona's childhood and her parents. But we also have to acknowledge the role that society played in shaping her view of herself. Because even if Fiona had wanted to embrace her ogre side, the truth is, society never would have allowed it. The very first Shrek film makes it crystal clear. Ogres are seen as monsters. Society views them as dangerous, ugly, and undeserving of love. The opening scene shows villagers literally chasing Shrek with pitchforks ready to kill him, even though he hadn't harmed anyone. The only reason Shrek lives peacefully is because he isolates himself in a swamp, far away from the rest of the world. And while Shrek jokes about enjoying his solitude, the reality is that living among people would have never been an option. He would always be met with fear, rejection, or violence. Now think about Fiona growing up under the weight of that knowledge. When her parents locked her in the tower, they weren't just protecting her from the curse. They were shielding themselves from society's judgment. They knew that an ogre princess wouldn't be accepted. Just like a frog king wouldn't have been accepted if Harold had married Lillian in his true form. That's why Harold made a deal with the fairy godmother in the first place. Because society rewarded the human image of royalty, not the reality of who he really was. And Shrek 2 really drives home how much appearances matter in this world. When Shrek and Fiona arrive to Far, Far Away, the kingdom is basically Hollywood for fairy tales. Everything is glamorous, polished, and rooted in perfection. Fiona's parents are paraded as royalty, the fairy godmother runs her own corporation and literally sells happily ever afters, and Prince Charming is worshipped for his beauty. In that kind of world, Fiona was never going to be seen as enough in her ogre form. The fairy godmother even says it outright when she confronts Shrek. She says people don't get happily ever afters, they get what they deserve. And in her eyes, Shrek and Fiona didn't deserve to live happily ever after because they weren't traditionally beautiful or the storybook couple that society wanted them to be. In her eyes, Shrek was too ugly, too crude, too monstrous, and Fiona was wasting her potential as a human princess by staying with him. To Fairy Godmother and to Far, Far Away, love isn't about what's authentic. It's about image. And that's really the heart of Fiona's struggle. Her whole life, she was taught that her human side was valuable because society told her it was. That's why Lord Farquaad was so quick to marry her in the first movie. It wasn't about love. It was about appearances. Of course, he also wanted to be a king, but he chose Fiona because she looked like the perfect princess that he could parade around, even though he never cared about who she actually was. But the second the ogre part of her came out, society would strip that value away. So when Fiona chose to remain an ogre, she wasn't just rejecting her parents' expectations. She was rejecting society's too. She was rejecting the mobs with pitchforks, the shallow admiration of Farquaad, the fairy godmother's manipulative idea of deserving, and even the glitzy fairy tale perfection of Far, Far Away. Fiona understood that being human might have made life easier, but it would have been a life built on lies, fear, and performance. Staying an ogre meant choosing to be authentic in a world that told her that she wasn't good enough. And that's exactly what makes her decision so powerful. Although Shrek is open about how lonely it feels to be feared and rejected by everyone, he's also very clear about one thing. He loves being an ogre. That's part of what makes him so different from Fiona when we first meet her. The opening scene of the very first movie says it all. Shrek wakes up, brushes his teeth with the bug, takes a mud shower, farts in the water, and then sits down to a dinner of eyeballs. It's gross, over the top, but it's also joyful. Shrek isn't ashamed of who he is. He takes pride in his swamp, his body, and in the life that he built for himself, even if society labels him as a monster. In a strange way, Shrek makes being an ogre look kind of beautiful. It's not glamorous, but it's authentic. And Fiona, who has spent most of her life hiding her ogre side in shame, sees that up close. She sees someone who has been told his whole life that he's hideous and unworthy, and yet he still finds happiness in being unapologetically himself. For Fiona, that perspective was completely new. And what's so powerful is that Shrek doesn't fall in love with Fiona because she's a princess. In fact, he actively rejects her polished princess act. He likes her when she's most authentic, when she's tough enough to take down Robin Hood and his merry men, and when she lets out a massive burp at the dinner table. Those are the moments that Shrek falls for her, not the moments when she's performing the role that her parents and society told her to play. And because Shrek is an ogre himself, Fiona knows deep down that he can never be disgusted by her. That's why, for the first time in her life, she feels safe enough to let her guard down. Around Shrek, she doesn't have to hide parts of herself that she was told to bury. She can laugh out loud, she can eat a lot, she can fight hard, and she can be too much. And instead of being shamed for it, she celebrated. When Fiona looks at Shrek, she doesn't just see a partner, she sees a mirror. He embodies the part of herself that she was always taught to hate, the side that she was told was unworthy of love. But Shrek shows her the opposite. He shows her that the ogre side of her isn't a curse. It's just another version of who she really is. And more importantly, it's a version worthy of love. By the time we reach the end of Shrek 2, Fiona's decision makes perfect sense. Choosing to stay an ogre isn't just about choosing Shrek. It's about choosing herself. It's about embracing the side of her that she's always been told to hide, and realizing that it's the truest, most authentic version of her. Fiona's choice to stay an ogre is so much more than a fairy tale twist. It's her finally breaking free from everything that she was told she had to be. Her parents' expectations, the fairy godmother's manipulation, society's obsession with appearances, even the story that she once believed about herself. For her entire life, Fiona thought that her curse was the thing that made her unworthy. But by choosing to stay in that form, she turns the curse into her freedom. She reclaims the part of herself that she was taught to hide, and she says, "This is who I am, and I'm not ashamed anymore." And all of that is what makes this moment so powerful. Fiona doesn't just choose Shrek. She chooses love without conditions. She chooses a life where she can laugh too loud, eat too much, fight too hard, and still be seen as enough. She chooses the imperfect version of the happily ever after that feels real, instead of the polished, hollow version that she was promised as a kid. And what's even more moving about her decision is that it breaks the cycle that her father was trapped in. King Harold spent most of his life hiding his true self out of fear of rejection, and Fiona refuses to make that same mistake. She embraces what makes her different, and in doing so, she finally steps into the kind of freedom that her parents, and even the society around her, never thought was possible. So yes, on the surface, Fiona choosing to stay an ogre is a simple romantic ending. But when you look closer, it's about identity, shame, and self-acceptance. It's about realizing that happily ever after isn't about fitting into someone else's story. It's about writing your own. And that's why for me, Fiona's decision at the end of Shrek 2 isn't just one of the best moments in the Shrek universe, but it's one of the most powerful moments in any fairy tale story.